academic institutions, and it is our gift, our task, to nurture the relationship between religious education and the academic institutions, including seminaries, colleges, and schools. So we have, for this morning's plenary, brought together a panel of people who we believe can give us a view from the balcony. That's what we've asked them to do. They're all scholars who have been in leadership positions in their various institutions, and so we've asked them to address the challenges and opportunities they see in the field. So I'm going to very briefly introduce them and ask them each to begin by telling us a little more about the context in which they serve. To my far right is Justus Baird, who is the director of the Center for Multifaith Education at Auburn Theological Seminary in New York City, and he's been doing that since 2007. Thank you, Justus, for being with us today. Elizabeth Conde-Frazier is the Dean of Esperanza College at Eastern University, and many of you know her well. She's been with us often. Welcome, thank you. Faustino Cruz is the Academic Dean, Executive Vice President, and an Associate Professor of Theology and Education at the Franciscan School of Theology. These are a lot of words. At the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Tito, welcome. Thank you. Patricia O'Connell-Killen is the Academic Vice President at Gonzaga University and a friend to all of us. And Moala Sajik comes to us from Ankara. She is the head of teacher training for religious education at Ankara University. They each have 7 minutes to introduce themselves and talk about the challenges and opportunities they see. And then we hope we'll have about 15 minutes at the end of that time for Q&A here before we flood into our breakout sessions. Thank you.
Greetings. I want to start with a Jewish teaching from the Talmud that talks about how special learning is in the Jewish tradition. There's a great midrash that the rabbis ask if you're faced with a really difficult choice between saving your teacher and saving your parent, the rabbis say you should save your teacher first. Wow, that's like just put a stake in the ground right there. I've always wanted to use this text in a parent-teacher conference and see what it might draw up. I start with that to say, my tradition really values learning. And so that's the context that I'm coming from. Let me self-identify myself just very briefly. I am trained as a rabbi. I practice as a rabbi. My paycheck comes from almost 200-year-old Presbyterian seminary, which I still think is a little bit weird, but kind of cool. God made me into an educator and into an entrepreneur. So I sort of self-imagine myself as an edupreneur, so to speak, since entrepreneurs like to coin terms. I am a practitioner. In the words of, in the language of Jim Collins, author of Built to Last and Good to Great, I am more of a clock builder rather than a time teller. By that I mean, my first degree is engineering. I like to tear things apart and build new things rather than, I'm not a great pundit. So my comments about religious education will be coming more from someone who likes to build and play with things. My particular field experience is concentrated in multi-faith education, especially at the seminary level around the United States with seminarians and with faculty at seminaries, as well as with teenagers from conflict areas around the world and from local communities. We work in South Africa, Northern Ireland, Israel, Palestine, and the United States with a program called Face to Face, Faith to Faith. I also do a lot of work with religious leaders as well. We conduct a ministry program there. That's part A of my field experience, and part B of my field experience is in the realm of Jewish education, especially supplementary Jewish education. So, I want to share briefly 3 things that I think are my own responses to where we are, or where are we going, or where should we be going. These will be more proscriptive as opposed to predictive, meaning these are personal things that I would hope we would go to rather than, I don't consider consider myself, a pundit or prophet. Okay, first one. I think that all religious education needs to much better be deeply situated in a multi-faith context. We are all minority religions today. Doesn't matter where you come from. If you look at any survey of religious communities in America, all of us have these tiny little slivers of our communities. Okay, we're all fine. Christians, you guys are 76% of America, but I know Christians well enough to know that's not that meaningful in terms of lived religious life. Okay, we have it. Jews have it too. The synagogue we belong to, the synagogue we sit at right across the street. So every religious tradition has we are all minorities. Second, our religious identity, especially here in America, is heavily influenced by non-adherents, by people outside of our own religious tradition. We learn to be something because of someone else who makes us that something. And our religious education has to take that and become much better. Third, our spiritual worldview, the kind of theology or religious worldview or spirituality that we teach, has to give a real place for the capital O other. We don't do that so well in religious education. Our young people especially are asking how their friends of these other communities fit into that worldview. Fourth, we learn so much about others from the news, and the people in the news who are representing our religious traditions may not be teaching others about what we would want. Does Jeremiah Wright, for instance, represent, all of Christianity to America or to people outside of America? In my own community, does the Gaza conflict or a federal raid on a kosher meat house packing plant in Iowa well represent my Jewish tradition? We learn about other religions from the news, and so as religious educators, we have a deep responsibility to make sure that we're giving a real source of other forms of learning about others. And finally, in this first category, multi-faith context has penetrated not just our pews, but our families in very deep ways. Our traditions need to really start struggling with what it means to build serious religious identity when our immediate family members are not in the same religious community as us. Okay, that's the first one. Deeply situate all religious education in multi-faith context. Number two, and I'm struggling with the language here, so maybe you can help me out with this. The structures and forms of religious education, the structures and the forms, must be better aligned to meet the challenges of our lived religious life. So I'm going to try to give examples of what I mean by that and self-critique the Jewish educational world at the moment. The dropout rate in Jewish education after bar mitzvah is terrible. If we were to ask Jews even, what do you think of people who drop out of school at age 13? We would say, it's a tragedy. And yet that's exactly what we do in our religious education. Every one of us drops out at age 13. That is a serious structural problem. A huge part of Jewish life is based on family. But we have created a Jewish education system that is all about drop-off learning. Okay? We'll teach our kids, drop them off from this hour to this hour, and they will learn everything they need to know. That's wrong. We tell kids they are unique. We teach them that they are created with Tselem Elohim in the image of God, and then we put them through a factory process of learning as if all of these unique individuals are going to learn in the same way at the same time. That's wrong. We teach them that Judaism is a subject in school and not a way of life. Schooling and death, for me, should not be the structural starting point for religious education. It's just not what I experience as what it means to be a Jew. It's not how I imagine myself as a Jew at a desk. It's not a subject. It's a way of life. And our religious education has to respond to that. So the third one, my own experiment in that, which I mentioned briefly in the lightning talk, is a program called Yerusha. We're experimenting with restructuring those forms of Jewish education, and we're having a lot of fun doing it. Okay, third one. Religious education needs a full partnership with neuroscience. And let me just say, I did not know that next year's, I'm not brown-nosing here, I had no idea that the subject of the next talk was about neuroscience. But I really think that is something we have to really address. Here's what I mean. If you were a sports coach, and you were trying to create great athletes, and you didn't know anything about lungs or hearts or muscles, you would not be that good at your job. Right? The brain is the organ of learning. And if we don't know it well, we are not going to be so good at our jobs. We have to know it better. And by the way, I think we have a lot to offer the field. Our traditions have a lot of wisdom, thousands of years of learning about human experience that I think those brain scientists could do something with. All right, here's a few exciting examples. One of my favorite teachers in this world is Eric Kandel, who won the Nobel Prize. He's a Holocaust survivor as well. His deep desire to understand human memory comes from his childhood experiences of loss. He learned the chemical and physical difference between short-term and long-term memory, for instance, and he has something to teach us about how chemicals are involved in short-term learning and neural growth is involved in long-term learning. Well, we've known about short-term and long-term learning for memory for a long time. Now we can start to understand better what that might look like in terms of how we teach some of these things. The role of attention is a huge issue in brain science and something that we actually know about because of our classroom and educational experience. Prayer and meditation and all these ways we have are actually ways of harnessing attention and its role in learning. We have to really dig into this a lot deeper. And finally, in this area of neuroscience, the neuroscientists have learned that our brains are radically shaped by what we do. That, a violinist, for instance, if you look at the muscle neural sensors of a violinist, right, from their different hands, are radically different between right and left hand. What does that mean? It means we have to be really serious about what all of our adherents are doing, because our brains are literally shaped by everything we do from the day that we grow. We have to take that into account in terms of the kind of learning that we do. So I believe that we are creative bits Elohim, and that learning about the brain, will teach us something about how God created us. And for the theologians in the room, I actually think it will teach us something about God as well, by understanding it better. Okay, so just to summarize, these are the three things. Situating religious education in a multifaith context. Second, structuring or forming religious education to be better aligned with a lived religious experience. And third, a full partnership between education and neuroscience. Those are the things that I'm thinking about right now.
I am going to talk about the tragedy of people who drop out at high school, and more so in particular communities, and what that has to do with religious education. I'm a dean at Esperanza College, which is a hybrid institution in that it is a partnership between a community development corporation for economic development and a faith-based college, university. And so the partnership between these two make possible the education in a community where most of the students are going to be first generation going to college. Okay? Working with grassroots projects as a religious educator began embracing me and making more of me over the years. The theories that inform my practice, the research methodologies that I sought to perfect as part of my scholarship, the content of my inquiry, the teaching that I did, all of them moved me towards communities where addressing the inequities of education, both public education and theological education, became my passion. Today I work at Esperanza College, a branch campus of a Christian university that comes from the vision of a group of pastors and community organizers for the empowerment and economic development of the fourth poorest county in the United States today, North Philadelphia. I serve as dean of the college, but also as vice president for education at the larger Esperanza project that is comprised of a charter high school, workforce development, housing, immigration, legal counseling, and reform, which includes teaching Latino leaders to do advocacy in Washington, D.C., financial literacy, economic development, music and art for identity formation, and the Capacity Training Institute for nonprofits in 9 different urban communities across the United States, with the purpose of making them stronger so that they can continue to provide their services over the long term. One can see the educational aspects that are involved in this multidimensional project. Esperanza, Inc. emerged in 1987 out of the theological reflections and the struggles, la lucha, of the Hispanic clergy of North Philadelphia, a group that continues to give strong leadership to the project. The crucial parts of this project is how they formulate an educational ecology and how they help the community to become engaged in the dialogue and policy making for education. As religious educator in this context, I have a multi-layered role to play, and I must bring all of the tools of my discipline to bear on this undertaking. I must also learn about the different types of education that are involved, as well as the political dimensions of education at these multiple levels. I must ride the tensions and create integrative parameters between church and state, mission and ecclesiology. I must facilitate ways for persons to articulate their theologies and to create theory that accompanies their practices. More specifically, as dean of the college, I must find ways to create a college-going consciousness in the community where literacy is very low and the dropout rate is anywhere from 64 to 82%. Invention begins with imagination. Dewey said ideas and aspirations can be used to reorganize the environment. Esperanza College now celebrates 10 years of reorganizing, and its alums have started businesses that address badly needed services and are now the directors of some of the social service agencies and programs that they have reorganized in this environment. Yet, there is still much work to do. The difficult economy has greatly affected this community. My students may not have food or adequate childcare for their young ones, or health care that provides the healing needed for the traumas of their lives caused by the violence in the community. An 18-year-old, a young man, was deeply depressed because in 1 year, 13 of his closest friends and relatives had been murdered on the streets. His cohort, the class which you journey with throughout the 2 years, we have cohorts at the college, his cohort became his supporters as they encouraged him to stick to his life goals during this period of his life, and together they sought to address the violence. As dean, it was my job to provide an escort for him so that he could come to school safely. This is not education as usual, you've already figured that out, but a project of Shalom Salam, and as such, it is a very ambitious goal of seeing a community being transformed. I am administrator as well as pastor, while challenging and training myself and the faculty to keep the ideals and the models of liberative pedagogy that I have written and taught about as guides for this journey of social justice. This is where you really test your theory. Eventually, it is my students, however, who will change their community. In a time of great demographic shift in this country, so that the college-age population is now going to be mainly Hispanics for the next 20 to 25 years, if not look at who's in high schools today, these students have been ill-prepared for college. And this type of work that I am doing now is begging for innovative educators who understand that social justice is providing an education not for upward mobility, but for the reinvention of communities that they may flourish with life. On October 9, 2009, Secretary of Education Arne Duncan said the following: "Education is the civil rights issue of our generation. It is a daily fight for social justice." So, what is the flow? I will end with this. There are 3 streams that flow together in doing this work: faith, reason, and justice. Faith includes a deep connection, in my case, to the biblical narrative, as it informs the call to justice that begins with the faith community and then extends outwardly into the larger community as an expression of their faithfulness. This creates a networking of relationships as vínculos. That's a very special word in Spanish. Vínculos, partnerships for life in that community. Faith is the root of the courage and the hope to strive together for fashioning that hope. Faith is prayer and blessing and redemptive work. Reason is the continued critical reflection and strategic thinking that helps one to respond organically and with wisdom to the many modes of operation that injustice takes and retakes. It keeps morphing. In Spanish we say, las estructuras crean hábitos. Structures create habits. Reason reinvents and reimagines structures that create new habits of living and builds pathways for new future to pass among us, that we may relate more justly to one another. Finally, the stream of justice is dialogue, networking, and organizing. It is the political and compassionate dimension of care. The crossing of these streams has become for me my faithful practice as religious educator. And I invite you to hear more about this flow during the breakout time. But beyond that, to take a few dips into the crossing streams yourselves as an exploration or a vocational consideration as a religious educator. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Peace be with you. Culturally, it's very difficult for me to introduce myself by describing what I do, because culturally it's very important for us as Filipinos to really identify the communities to whom we belong. So rather than saying, my long list of credentials based on my institutional affiliations, it's very important for me to describe how I came to the United States as an immigrant from the Philippines close to 30 years ago. I come from a family of 10 children, and this is how I would describe the psychology of my family. Currently, there are 5 academic deans among the 10 children that my father has. And that underlies the value that we place in education, thinking that education was what was going to really allow us to grow more fully as humans. You never say to one another growing up, when I grow up, I'd like to be an academic dean. So I wanted to also stress that what I'm going to share with you is more a reflection of my vocation as an academic leader. How did this all begin in the first place? I just thought that the first time I applied to the Institute of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry at Boston College, I was not accepted. But there was something about me that was always searching for relevance. It said, Tito, you can't just go back to parsing Hebrew verbs. You really need, after 7 years of being a pastor in an inner city intercultural parish, you really have to find a way to make meaning of the questions, the realities, the joys, and the pains of being an intercultural inner city pastor. It is going back to the question, what did I not learn in the seminary in the first place? It's going back to understanding what a congregation really looks like, and what are the dynamics that allow a congregation within this ecology of ministry. I was really looking for a program that was relevant and that was going to allow me to come up with an alternative vision of pastoral practice. But most of the literature that I found, PhD programs in the early 1990s, were too structured for me. They really fit within the traditional categories of Bible, theology, history, and pastoral practice. And I didn't feel like anything would really embrace me, because what I was looking forward to was integration. So I was very insistent. I knocked on the doors of the Institute the second time. And you really need very critical allies like Maureen O'Brien, who would give you a second chance. She says, why don't you apply? And maybe your articulation of your vision might have shifted after having left parish life. You see, in parish life, we don't talk like academics. So maybe my theory is that when I applied and when I stated my intent, that it did sound like it really fit. The language that I provided to articulate my vision really did fit the language of my academy. So I found the words that would allow me to enter into conversation, not only with the communities of faith with whom I ministered, but a new ally, which was the academy. As a Roman Catholic seminarian, I've never heard of the discipline called religion and education. And to this day, I work in the Seminary School of Theology that does not have any Christian education or religious education requirements. So I didn't know that the field even existed. But there was another piece to this. When I felt called by the people to pursue higher studies, my community said, no way. We don't do that. It's not part of our charism. So my provincial superior said, well, you would have our blessing, but you have to find your own way. So that's another way for me to knock on Boston College's door. It was very difficult to form an identity because, first of all, I was not used to using one name to identify who I am or to identify what I did. Is it religious education? Is it religion and education? Is it theology and education? Is it practical theology? Why did I end up presenting at conferences that were not specifically in theology and education, such as the American Psychological Association, the American Educational Research Association, American Sociological, or the Association of Sociology of Religion? I realized that one of the ways that allowed me to be a scholar was by allowing all these communities of learning to embrace me. Then there came applying for a job. Within the Roman Catholic tradition of the time, there was no posting for an assistant professor in religious education. So when you apply, you learn to invent yourself. So is it okay not to have one name? And I realized it was the best ticket to a good job. Because what I really was provided was a canvas to paint on, rather than a coloring book, in which to color within the margins and the lines of an embedded image. I also think of myself as a musician who improvised like a jazz musician, rather than someone who played sheet music. The first title of a posting that I responded to was a posting for an assistant professor in faith and culture. But as soon as I got the job, I said, you might want to think about this title because you don't want people to think that I'm the only one with faith in the room. Or that I'm the only one with culture. So, as an academic, as a professor, it was interesting for me to make full use of the canvas that the institution to which I was accountable provided me. But as a religious educator, I realized that I had the language of curriculum. Intentionally, I knew the content, the purpose, the environment, and the method. I always look at my reality through various lenses or frames of ecology, culture, process, and resource. I was very intentionally aware of what was explicit, what was implicit, or what was null. I was always going forward, imagining the many facets of the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor aspects of education and faith. I knew the language of multiple intelligence. I knew the language of fitness for purpose. But learning too much about curriculum, I realized, also has its dangers because you would be called to become the academic dean. But the question always is, how am I going to stay relevant? So moving from a pastoral, vocational, ministerial question of relevance, I moved to the curricular, academic, programmatic questions of relevance, to institutional questions of relevance. How would I lead a community of learning that would really address the student learning outcomes, the charisms, the gifts, of the community that we are called to serve. And I would like to highlight my sister Elizabeth's emphasis on being a member of an ecology of theological education. I served as the convener of the Council of Deans of the Graduate Theological Union, which is an ecumenical and multi-faith partnership among mainline and Roman Catholic schools of theology, with its Center for Islamic Studies, Buddhist Studies, Orthodox Studies, and now Islamic Studies. The question for us is, how can we be facilitators of inclusive conversation among one another? How can we share and negotiate possibly differing visions of theological education? To whom are we accountable? Who are the publics that we serve? How are we going to assess the viability of the institutional goals, the program goals, and the student learning goals that we're trying to maintain and nurture? So the question for me is not whether we are going to remain relevant. The question for us as theological educators is, how are we going to allow theological education to be relevant, accessible, inclusive, intercultural, and effective? We will never be known by just one name, and we would not be known simply by one image. I believe that we would be known by the multiple images that make up the collage, the big picture that we have created together, a vision of faith-based higher education in general. Because I firmly believe that for theological education to remain relevant, we have to nurture the relevance of faith-based higher education in general. It will be a vision grounded in our commitment to promoting the inherent dignity and protecting the inalienable right of all humans without exception, knowing that we are created equally as God's image. And for those of us who are members of Christian faith, communities of Christian faith, it is promoting a vision of educating disciple citizenship who will perform God's activity of peacemaking, justice doing, and life-giving action in the world that is grounded in our baptismal call, anointed as sanctifier, proclaimers, and leaders in the world. Working for the common good, working to act the right action. Thank you.
We were asked to say something about our context. I am currently the academic vice president at Gonzaga University. Actually went back this July, and this fall when I welcomed the freshmen, I told them that 40 years previously I had stood where they had stood as new college students. I am a once and always Roman Catholic. A lot of people think I was somehow a Lutheran pastor because I spent 21 years at Pacific Lutheran University. But I'm a once and always Roman Catholic laywoman who grew up in an ethnic, rural Catholic farming community, was the first person in her family to go to college, might as well have gone to the moon, and have worked in Episcopalian, Lutheran, and Roman Catholic settings. The abiding question for me, and this really is part of my context because it's my intellectual context, has always been how people think or don't think in, with, and through the resources of the religious wisdom tradition. That's where the art of theological reflection came from. That's part of why I've written about the character of religion in the Pacific Northwest, which is my home. Exactly 48 hours ago, I was sitting in Thomas Berry Hall on Whidbey Island at the Whidbey Institute, a place some of you may know about. in a circle with 25 other university faculty representing an array of disciplines and higher education institutions in Western Washington. We had been convened for a 2-day exploration of the theme, Contemplation and Sustainability. How contemplative and reflective practices currently were or could or should be incorporated into sustainability education. All the participants expressed a desire to teach in ways that are true to their deep, abiding concern for their students and for all beings, though the language of moral education would have been utterly opaque to them. All had their own spiritual practice. Nearly all presume that contemplative practices, and here you should read wondrous tools from East and South Asian religions primarily. They got a little twitchy when I said Christians did contemplation too. Could or should be incorporated into courses of all kinds in order to increase their students' ability to deal with their own grief and despair, students' sense of connectedness to all that exists, and students' sense of the urgency regarding environmental challenges. Yet, only a very small minority among those 25 in the room thought the connection of contemplative practices to the living communities of faith from which they came, or to the theological visions of those communities, was even remotely relevant to the conversation or the project at hand. 4 days earlier, I had sat around a table in the Green and Boardroom at Gonzaga University with my fellow faculty members in the Religious Studies Department and the new Bishop of Spokane, who spoke very eloquently about the fact that he had come to be the bishop of a bankrupt diocese that already had the list of parishes it would sell and had entered mediation and literally was on the precipice as all its structures basically had unraveled. I share those two stories because they represent, I think, what I see as the big meta challenge for those who are involved in religious education. On the one hand, religious educators have existed for a long time. Well, let me back up and just say what these are. To put it very simply, the questions you ask, the wisdom you have about how, in fact, you bring people, faith, human flourishing, community, and context together is really needed and is what a whole lot of folks want. I think a religious educator would have helped that 2 days of conversation. And yet, the notion that what you do is relevant or essential to a whole set of conversations just is not on people's radar screen. So, the questions you ask are questions that people are asking all over the place. Go to a group of sociologists and listen to them talking about the sociological imagination. Go sit with all the folks, and this is like the field growing like weeds, leadership studies. Help me figure out what it is. Because they are basically the latest form of moral education. Look at the passion of undergraduate faculty, particularly newer undergraduate faculty, about doing interdisciplinary work. And they're trying to figure out how to do what religious educators have been doing through the history of your profession. So one side of the challenge is people don't understand what you do. The second side of the challenge, I would say, however, is that you as religious educators really have existed on the boundary for a long time of stable institutions, or at least religious institutions that were demographically thick enough to provide you a platform on which you could be, and you were more than anybody else and still are, the boundary crossers. You are the ones who have thought creatively in relation to the disciplines of the social, human, and natural sciences, the ones who are willing to take head on what are the big social issues of our time. Now those institutions are unraveling and, in an effort at self-survival, hardening their own boundaries in ways that I think complicates your work, because fundamentally religious educators are about the nurturing of imagination that comes when people rub up against the genuinely liberating power of a religious theological heritage. So I think as we think about the future of religious education, the question of intelligibility and the question of what it means to carry forward or provide access to religious traditions for which most people don't understand why they ought to bother are two very large questions by way of challenge. One other question that I think is connected here or challenge to you has to do precisely with something you've helped to promote, and that is the democratization of access to the sacred. There is no question that religious education as a field has promoted thinking about faith formation or moral education around the development of relationships and the honoring of people's experience. What now has become, I think, a profound challenge is whether or not expertise or knowledge in the deep and Jewish sense of that term, not just mere technical information and packets of content that you shove around. How do you connect people to profound pieces of the heritage? And that gets me then to what I think are very briefly, what I think the resources are that are in the practice of religious education to address both of those questions. One more minute. To address both of those questions. And it is this. And I think as I think about the future of religious education, it is these things and not defining the boundaries of a field that matters the most, because the truth is everything you do, other people have been co-opting and taking to their own without necessarily acknowledging you. I think the last 30 years has seen incredible plagiarism of the field of religious education without acknowledgement. These are, I think, deep resources in the practice and community of religious education. One, that the imagination matters, and that the imagination is cultivated by your attention to very particular people and their engagement with very profound practices and teaching. Secondly, because you are in education/formation, you are the ones who think about how do you make the moves. Not the grandiose unified field theory of what ought to happen, but you are the artful observers of what actually does it take to align people, context, and information in ways that the liberation and extension of imagination is possible. Third, you are the carriers of the act question. And if there is anything that's moving us, I think, through the next 40 years, it's going to be the act question. And finally, I think because of the incredibly interdisciplinary character of the work religious educators do, you are the ones who inhabit a contemplative mind. You know how to pause and ponder. I am at Gonzaga. I refer to myself as I am a teacher who loves the classroom more than anything else. I am a historian who goes absolutely gaga over small, very old paper of historical documents and archives. And I am an accidental administrator to a very great extent. But the reason I'm willing to embrace the call of accidental administration, quite frankly, to make this very personal and concrete, is this. The Jesuits at Gonzaga gave me my life when they gave me an education. This is a profoundly liberating tradition of education and formation, which we have about 15 years how to figure out, how to pass on to a culture and to a community that doesn't think tradition is worth much as the Jesuits die out and as we deal with really profound global problems, not the least of which is the survival of the environment and the species. And that's, I think, a project to which religious educators are profoundly called. Thank you.
I would like to greet you all with one of God's attributes in Islam, which is hikmah. That means wisdom. Wisdom is a common name for all traditions, and I wish a good future for religious education and a good progress in wisdom. I will talk with you with my Islamic background as an academician, and also under the experiences I had in my life journey as in some executive positions. And I will say, Islamic religious education needs a theology open to education. Let me elaborate briefly. The feature of religious education as a subject and the feature of research in religious education are closely connected. Within religious education as a subject, we have a question whether religious education is a theological discipline or an educational one. Within research, I think, studies need to be done with respect how to meaningful dialogue can be established between theology and education. I will talk under the Turkish religious education experience. A short glance on where we are. In 1982, after Turkish legislation was rearranged, religious education turned out to be a compulsory school subject, which was formally selective. That RE became a compulsory school subject in a secular society and overwhelming majority Muslims caused contradictory views to emerge and many questions were raised. Among these were, why in a secular society should school take the responsibility of the mosque? How about the parents who do not want their kids to study religion? Can religious education be open to those people who have no religious background, besides to those who have various Islamic interpretation of life? For it is almost 20 years, education tended to leave the field of RE under the question of how it should be taught. And research is made on the developmental religious education and different teaching methods and techniques. The last 10 years, the role of theology has emerged under the question of what counts as Islam in school. In particular, a group of scholars in the Faculty of Divinity, Ankara University, where I work in, pointed to Islamic movements and interpretations in the history of Islam and in modern times in favor of individual authenticity and emphasis on reason, discussion the relationship between reason and faith. Research started to deal with the issues of diversity, learning about the other, the woman in Islam, Islam and democracy, human rights in Islam, and so on. Within this process, Islamic cultural heritage has been reinterpreted in a scholarly and critical approach. The major hadith collection, such as Bukhari and Muslims, have been exposed to critical analysis. Reference to the historicity of the Quran have been raised, and studies on hermeneutical aspect of the Quran and the occasions of the revelation have increased. This scholarly movement was described with such names as Rethinking Islam, Reconstruction in Religious Field, and Re-Understanding and Re-Explanation of Islam. All these attempts have met certain needs. However, the information produced in academical circles is not yet sufficient to constitute the theological basis of religious education and develop reflection on religious education in the context of individual and the challenges of our age. I can say we have sort of confidence with RE as an educational subject, but sort of uncertainty with religious education as a theological subject. Islamic RE needs a relevant theology in order to transform the result of these academical discussions, as I mentioned, into class setting and to unite the content and the method of education. The need for that is In particular, the view that arises from the fundamental sources of Islam and the common understanding formed in the course of history calls for a religion that is present in all spheres of life. Yet in modern times, what belongs to religious domain and what is left up to the individual is a matter of controversy. Islamic religious education faces the tension between preserving religious identity and responding to the demands of modernity. The claims concerning inflexibility and universality of Islam with regard to its contextual, indigenous, and fleeting dimensions stand before educators as challenges to deal with in Islamic religious education. That is, to live in a secular and plural society and to what extent to become a Muslim. I ask the question, will these challenges continue to suppress religious education, or will the field be able to open up new thinking using contemporary methods of education? In the process of answering this central question, my suggestion would be to do extensive conceptual studies on the Quran. And I name this attempt as conceptual clarity. And I ask whether we can do more than simply memorize the Quran or use the Quranic text to support a particular set of belief. In a world of religious diversity, researches on the main concepts of religions are of vital importance. Learning in interreligious terms includes learning about the conceptual schema of our own and the others as well. Obviously, more awareness about various cultures of the world is needed in education. Also, more conceptual studies can help to improve the flow of information, analysis, and guidance on the challenges we face in learning how to live together. I would be pleased to discuss the theological framework which I work on for years for conceptual clarity in Islam. With these distinguished scholars, I believe the feedback I received from you will help me to develop my work in a more scholarly way. And I would like to thank you all for your attention.
And we don't have time for questions from the floor. We want to honor the time that we had in more intimate conversation. I'm going to thank you all for that wonderful conversation that you have begun. And I'm going to